Okay, this is the final video for tonight. We're going to look at kind of how pundits and scholars started thinking about what was happening in politics. And the debate came down to are we in a era where the elites are being polarized or whether the voters are being polarized? It was clear that politics was broken. We were no longer to solve our mass problems through the political system we had. So why did that happen? Um, and the debate broke out whether it was just elites that were polarized or whether it was voters. Is it that something has changed in the structure of Congress, or even in the people who are elected to Congress that has broken it down, or is it that the voters are picking people in a partisan manner? I mean, and to what extent are have the voters changed, and then to what extent has the have elected officials changed? And so that's the real core of the elite versus popular polarization debate. There's really three different things that can happen here. One is that politicos, the elected officials, the campaigns, the parties, the interest groups, all of those things, those and the media, those people are all polarized, but the rest of us don't care. Another argument is that the politicos are polarized, and they're bringing the rest of the country along with them. And then there's a final one that says, it's really voters that are polarized, and the people they are electing are a reflection of their own polarization at the ground level. And so, um, part of this is just a looking at the data differently, and we're going to look how that happens. But it also may show a bias towards what you believe is the nature of participatory democracy. If you think that if you're more likely to have a bureaucratic elite orientation just in general, not in this moment, but in general, you're going to think that it's elites driving it. If you have a more mass politics orientation, then you're going to think it's the masses that are driving it. And that indeed does get out. Okay, so elite polarization says that the polarization is almost entirely between the party in government and the party in opposition, i.e., Republicans and Democrats, and that the only people who are really involved with this are politicians, the political class, the people who make their living in some way or another around politics, and the most vocal activist citizens. So you might have, a local activist who's really cares about politics and may get really partisan, but their next door neighbor isn't, kind of thing. The mass polarization says that the electorate's attitudes are neatly divided along partisan lines. And at the extreme in polarization, citizens see that members of the other party and the other party's policies are an existential threat of their way of life. When you think about if something is an existential threat, way more likely to fight differently than if it's just a, oh, I don't care kind of thing. So just think about it not in terms of politics at all. You're walking down the street and you see somebody who looks kind of scruffy, and you don't do anything. You don't care. But if that person comes up and thugs you over the head, you're going to fight back, right? And so, if the other side is annoying, or they have policies that you don't like but you can live with, it becomes far less of a life and death struggle than if you think that they're wiping out your way of life. And we see this in both liberals and conservatives today, thinking that the other side is trying to eliminate the values they hold dearest. Um, so let's look first at elite polarization. Um, so there's definitely some talk about polarization. And Morris Fiorina, a political scientist, wrote a book saying, "Is polarization a myth?" He was saying, we're the political class is talking about how polarized we are, talking about dysfunction in Congress, but not really polarized. It's really the elites that are polarized, not people. And he thought that the system was broken because of partisan warriors, not because of anything that was happening on the ground. Insiders, he thought, had grown farther and farther away from mainstream America and did not understand what was important to mainstream Americans. He put out this proposal, I think, in early 2000s. And so he was interviewed again after the 2016 election, and they said, were you wrong? And he insisted he was right. And he said that um, most voters still hold a mix of conservative and liberal positions, and that aren't necessarily their views aren't necessarily encapsulated in one party. And to the extent that we do see this, it's a matter of sorting, not a matter of polarization. Basically, all the Republicans are moving next to each other, and all the Democrats are moving next to each other. And so when we see some of the outcomes, and we see red states and blue states, it's not because people are becoming more polarized. It's because, you know, liberal intellectuals are moving to the cities, and rural residents are staying put, and intellectuals tend to be more liberal, and rural residents tend to be more conservative. So that he thinks that that's a function. Um, he says here, and here are some of his justifications. First of all, the rise of the independent voter. So even as the Democratic and Republican parties are being more and more um, polarized and angry and all of that, we simultaneously see the number of people not identifying with either party rising, and he thinks that that's kind of the an indication that the elites are polarizing and turning off the masses. He also sees a rise of leaders like Trump and Bernie Sanders, whose policies really cut across established conservative and liberal lines. Um, One of the things about Trump is that he's done so many things that would have been just appalling to Republicans of 8, 10 years ago, because he doesn't hold the traditional conservative views. Bernie Sanders doesn't hold traditional Democratic views. I mean, he's not even a member of the party, and so we see that it may be that he argues, Fiorina argues that it's really about a partisan. It's about the party elites going to war with each other, and not really about what's happening on the ground. And he also points to how many of much of Trump's support comes from non-ideological positions. It's not so much that Trump supporters can point to a policy and say, "I like this policy." They say, "I like how he makes me feel," and it's not an ideologically based argument. The other argument is put forth or led by a man named Alan Abramowitz, who wrote a book called The Polarized Public. He points out that on a 7 point ideological scale, very liberal, liberal, somewhat liberal, neutral, somewhat conservative, conservative, very conservative, fewer and fewer voters are picking that neutral, that number 4, and we're also seeing a decline in the numbers 3 and 5. More and more people are moving to the numbers 1 and 7, and that shows that people themselves, that if you don't give them a party label, you just say, "Are you liberal? Are you conservative?" are identifying more with the extreme ends of that pole. We also see a greater consistency of voter opinions about issues. So there's no longer, if you give people 10 issues, um, the way they indicate they believe about number one, a pretty good indicator of what they'll believe about two, three, four, five, six. Whereas in the past there was at least some idea that you might feel one way about gun control and another way about education, and now all the people who feel about gun control one way also feel about education this one way. We also see a greater consistency on issues and party positions. That the Democratic Party is the party of gun control, the Republican Party is the party that'll defend Second Amendment right, that kind of thing. We also see that racial and educational divides in partisanship create identity-based politics, and we will go into that quite a bit more next week. But that we are seeing that it that your party label is affecting your things outside of partisanship. You're attaching value to your party label. And one of the arguments that Fiorina and his people put out is that what we're seeing is a failure of representation. We're seeing that the elites are so consumed with their own petty wars that they are failing to represent their constituents. Abrahamowitz says, no, that's not actually what's happening. What we are seeing is accurate representation, that Mitch McConnell really does represent what people in Kentucky want, and Dianne Feinstein really does represent what people of California want. And when they go to war against each other, they're going to war on behalf of their constituencies, not in spite of their constituencies. One of the big indicators is of polarization is this question: would you want your kid marrying, if you're a Republican, would you want your kid marrying a Democrat? And then the opposite question: would you want your kid marry? Would you a Republican? Would you a Democrat want your kid marrying a Republican? Um, Another way of putting this that might be a little more um, um, relevant to many of you is, would you swipe left on Tinder? If you saw somebody was, if you're a Republican and you saw somebody was a Democrat, would that make you reject them, before you knew anything else about them, and vice versa? And they're finding that is a huge driver of dating apps right now, is people trying to find mates that are just like them. So, mass polarization advocates say that, so sorry. So, in 1960, 5% of parents said that they would object to a child marrying a member of the other party. But by 2010, 50% of American parents said that they did not want their kid to marry somebody of the other party. Mass polarization advocates say that this indicates that party has become identity. That you feel just as strongly about party as you might once have felt about religion, or um, 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 about social class, or anything like that. The um, the elite polarization theories say that this is actually because of ideological sorting. So in 1960, a Republican woman comes home from college and says she wants to marry a Democrat. The parents don't say, Democrat, you can't do that. What they say is he a union guy? Is he a Southern Democrat? Is he a New York intellectual? And the word Democrat didn't necessarily convey that they were a certain type of person. It just, I mean, because there were a lot of different kinds of Democrats. On the Republican side, that was the same thing. Is he a is he a chamber of commerce type? Is he a is he an evangelical? It wouldn't necessarily tell you what the person was by telling you what their party was. Now, more and more, it tells the party you identify with tells a person that doesn't know anything more about you. It tells them that you are it gives them a heuristic about what kind of person you are and what kind of things you value. And parents do care a lot about the values of the spouse that their kid marries. So, going forward, we're going to look deeper into some of this, and because once the elite versus mass polarization debate crystallized, then scholars began to go deeper. And so, some of the things that they're asking, and we will ask in the future weeks, is how bad is